As a member from Windsor West.
Thank you, Speaker. It's my pleasure to rise on behalf of my constituents of Windsor West to talk about what's in the throne speech, or today I'm going to talk about what wasn't in the throne speech. But first, I want to thank the people of my community of Windsor West for putting their faith in me again for a second term and sending me back here to represent them and their voice and their concerns. And I can tell you that their voice is certainly not aligned with the other side of the House. So what I want to talk about is we've heard a lot, we're still hearing a lot, but we heard a lot during the campaign, and we're still hearing a lot about how the PCs are a government for the people. But the question that my constituents have is, which people are they for? Because when you look at, and if you had heard the throne speech, but if you go back and read it, there are a lot of people missing from that throne speech. Some of the most vulnerable people in this province were not mentioned in the throne speech. So their question is, am I your people? Am I the people you're for? Because you won't even talk about me. That's the question that I'm getting from my constituents. If the Conservatives are a government for the people, why am I not mentioned? Why are they not talking about helping me? So I want to say, first and foremost, Dave Lepofsky, I want to give him a mention. He is a tireless advocate for people with disabilities, especially those from the blind and low vision community. He very quickly noticed that there was no mention of people with disabilities in the throne speech. Not a mention. So as we are trying, and it's happening so slowly, too slowly in this province, as we are trying to move forward to support people with disabilities, to make every corner of this province more accessible to people with disabilities, including the building I'm standing in right now, the government, the PC government, doesn't see that as a priority. They don't even mention people with disabilities in the throne speech. And that's concerning to me, that's concerning to my constituents, and that's concerning to people across this province that have disabilities. Because what they need from their government is support, and to be moving the agenda forward, to be actually making progress in making sure that this province is accessible to everybody, that everybody has an opportunity to come to this building and listen to firsthand what we are doing here, to be able to have a sign language interpreter here if they need to have what they need should they be blind or low vision, to be able to understand what is going on here. And with a government who won't even mention people with disabilities in their throne speech is very concerning. People who are living in poverty, those in low-income families, or those living on social assistance, not mentioned in the throne speech. Not a word. That is a large portion of my riding are people who are low income, or people living in poverty, or people who are homeless. The invisible population, as my daughter refers to them. And she doesn't mean that in a loving way. It's very concerning to her that people that are living rough, living on the streets, are considered basically invisible human beings. And it's pretty sad that this PC government, through the throne speech and the lack of mention of low-income people and people living in poverty, those that are living rough, that are homeless, have been shown by their government that they are indeed the invisible population. No mention of First Nation or Indigenous people. Not a word. And yet these are some of our most vulnerable population as well. There's no mention about supporting their specific needs around health care, their specific needs around mental health supports, no mention about their specific needs when it comes to education. Nothing. There's no mention of ensuring that they have clean drinking water, something that most of us, if not all of us in this House, take for granted. You want a drink of water, you turn on the tap, you have a drink of water. Many people in our First Nations and Indigenous communities do not have that same opportunity as we do. There's no mention of housing, and I'm not just talking about housing, and I'm going to draw, you'll hear me repeat this when I'm talking about people living in supportive housing, if they are able to get into supportive housing. But right now I'm talking specifically about First Nation and Indigenous. We're not just talking about them having housing, we're talking about them having safe housing. I'm talking about them having housing that is actually habitable, something that all of us in this room would find acceptable to live in. But this government doesn't even mention First Nations or Indigenous people. Not a word. So what people are you for? There's no mention specifically of northern communities. Not a word. Now, I will tell you, I enjoy our northern communities in the summertime. I am from the deep south of the province, the sunny south as I call it, the Banana Belt. So I like to go up north when it's sunny, when it's warm. I'm certainly not a northern person in the winter. I grew up in London in the snow belt. I now live in the Banana Belt. I enjoy being in a moderate climate that I live in. However, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be talking about northern communities and their specific needs, their needs around transit. And this would also relate back to our First Nations and Indigenous people. When we're talking about northern communities, many northern communities, the cost of food is outrageous. It's unaffordable. When I look at what it costs for somebody to go buy produce in the north in the winter compared to what I pay, it's mind-boggling that there would be such a difference in the cost. And then if you look at those that are low-income people and those living in poverty in northern communities, that marginalizes them even more when you look at the cost of food. No mention of northern communities in the throne speech. Auto and manufacturing, not a word. Not a word. And yet, so many communities across this province, including mine, were called the automotive capital. No mention of auto and manufacturing. And I don't think that was a mistake. I actually don't think that was a mistake. I don't think most of what they left out of the throne speech was a mistake. They didn't do it accidentally. Usually, in the past, Conservatives, when they talked about our auto and manufacturing sector, they said, let it die. They were going to cut programs and spending, programs and supports to our auto sector. They called it corporate welfare. Now, I just want to point out that when you loan money to somebody and they pay it back, that's a loan. That's a loan, which happened in many cases with our auto manufacturing. But the point is, these sectors are so important, the auto and manufacturing sector, so important to our economy, so important to so many of our communities, including mine. And yet, previous Conservative leaders have said, we don't pick winners and losers. If they can't make it on their own, oh well, we're not investing in them. During the last campaign, not too long ago, within the last couple months, they actually had said they would cut the Jobs and Prosperity Fund. A slush fund. Oh, wow, the member from Nipissing Pembroke, I'm not sure if his writing name has changed, he's calling it a slush fund. This is how dedicated they are and how concerned they are about the people they claim to be for that work in the auto and manufacturing sector. He's calling the Jobs and Prosperity Fund a slush fund. Money that has actually gone into that sector and provided middle-class jobs. So according to the member for Nipissing Pembroke, they're not for the people that are middle-class working people. We certainly know they're not for unionized workers. That's probably why they don't like much of the auto and manufacturing sectors, because they're not for unionized people. Anyways, they didn't talk about the auto and manufacturing sector, and yet they have a minister who's in Washington who claims he's going to fight for those very jobs. And we have a PC member who's saying, well, the Jobs and Prosperity Fund is a slush fund. So really it draws the question to mind of how hard are they really going to fight against the tariffs coming from President Trump in the States, the threat of the tariffs coming that is going to decimate our auto sector. How hard are they really going to fight for those jobs when we have a PC member who's calling a fund that is an investment into that sector a slush fund? There are so many more people that are not mentioned in the throne speech. So again, I'm going to ask, if you're for the people, who are those people? When I look at my current critic portfolio, community and social services, I talk about people who are living on social assistance. Let's look at social assistance rates, because they didn't actually talk about helping people on social assistance. Actually, that probably wasn't by accident either, because the last time we had a Conservative government, they cut social assistance by 21%. 21%. So people who are already low income and struggling to get by, they said, you can get by with even less. And the worst, other than just cutting their supports by 21%, was what the then minister responsible for that portfolio, what he said. And what he said, Madam Speaker, was they could just go out and buy dented cans of tuna and eat bologna sandwiches. So rather than recognizing that these people needed more support, they cut the support they had and said, eat dented, not just tuna, dented cans of tuna and bologna sandwiches. So clearly, the people that they are for are not those people that are living on social assistance. When you look at people who have developmental disabilities, and I know they talked about autism, we'll go back to that one, because then we can talk about what their leader said about a group home for young men with autism. Because they're clearly, although they mentioned it in the throne speech, they're clearly not really for people with autism. But they don't actually talk about the broader spectrum of people with developmental disabilities. They don't talk about the fact that people with developmental disabilities are cut off supports and services as soon as they turn 18. They didn't talk about addressing this gap between 17 and 18. They didn't talk about that. They didn't talk about the crisis in supportive housing for people with developmental disabilities. And that's not surprising to me, because the now Premier at the time, when he found out, when he was receiving some complaints from community members about a group home for those with autism in his community, he said, well, I didn't know they'd go outside. So his thinking is that people with developmental disabilities should be locked away somewhere and not to be seen, rather than being contributing, involved members of their community. So it's not surprising to me that there really is no plan for everybody with a developmental disability, that there's no talk about supportive housing for people with developmental disabilities. There was no mention of dealing with the decades-long wait list for supportive housing for people with developmental disabilities. There was no talk about getting rid of the years-long wait list for them to get their supports and services back. So clearly, those are not the people they're for. They didn't talk about the people that actually work in developmental services. They didn't talk about the people that work in our supportive housing, what is available. They didn't talk about them. They didn't talk about the fact that these workers have incredibly difficult jobs, very emotionally draining jobs, and physically demanding jobs. They didn't talk about that. They didn't talk about the fact that these people, these workers, have stagnant wages. That many of these workers themselves are low income or living in poverty, and they don't have stable housing. They didn't talk about them at all, likely because the majority of them are also unionized workers, and again, we all know how the Conservatives feel about unionized workers. They didn't talk about the high cost of living. They didn't talk about the fact that food bank use is way up in my community alone, in my riding. The downtown mission serves, this is a staggering number, 700 people a day. 700 people a day go to eat at the downtown mission. That's one organization in my community, one. There are many more, unfortunately. A few years ago, it was 100 people a day. And I think it's really important to point out to this government, because they didn't talk about these people. Some of these people are homeless, but we have seniors that are going in to places like the downtown mission to eat because they don't have enough money to get by. So they have to make the choice. And these are just people going to actually get fed there, where this is not talking about the number of people that actually go in and use the food bank then, or access the clothing swap that they have and that kind of thing. And again, this is not even addressing the fact that we have shelters for women who are fleeing domestic situations, abusive domestic situations. So again, no mention of people with low income, because their plan isn't really for those people. What they did talk about was cutting $6.1 billion in social spending during the election, plus billions more lost by cancelling cap and trade and hundreds of green projects. Now, those things can be phased out. Contracts can be phased out as they come due. You can renegotiate, or you can decide not to renew. You shouldn't go off all haphazard cancelling contracts when it's going to cost people more. You shouldn't go haphazard cancelling programs that are actually going to be supporting some of these very people that I'm talking about. But that's what the PCs have done. In fact, they promised to leave no stone unturned when it came to privatizing the services that all of these people depend on. The PCs, now the government, promised to cut low income taxes for low income earners, which actually was found out to take money out of the pockets of low income earners. And yet the tax breaks on the high end, the people on the high end that were already making high wages, or their companies were making good money, were actually going to benefit more. Actually, the Premier himself would have benefited more under their plan than low-income people. And I want to point out, when I'm talking about, and I'm running out of time, and I haven't even got through most of this, but I want to go back to homeless people, low-income people, and those living rough, those that do not have a place to call home. Because there's a very important thing that I want to point out, because this just points to the fact that this PC government, when they talk about they're for the people, they're not talking about homeless people. They're not talking about low-income earners. And that was very clear when the now Premier picked up the phone to call the Mayor of Toronto, Mayor Tory, to stop a homeless shelter from being built in his own riding. To say that is shameful is an understatement. When you have so many people struggling, especially in a city like Toronto, to find affordable housing, for the now Premier to have picked up the phone to stop it was a temporary shelter, but it was a shelter. To have that stop from being built in his own riding is shameful, and it's very concerning. And it clearly points out that this government, when they say they're for the people, they are not for homeless people. They're not interested in assisting homeless people. So in the last little bit, I want to say many people in my riding are very concerned about what wasn't in the throne speech. And I think it's incumbent upon this government to address their specific needs. Thank you.
Thank you very much.